evening. I'm going to call the order of the Committee of Infrastructure being September 25th, 2019 at 7:03. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Alderman at Large Michael O'Brien.
Present.
Alderman Tom Lopez, not here as yet. Alderman Jan Schmidt, I am here. Alderman Ernest Jetty. Here. And Alderman Ken Gidge. Here. Also in attendance.
Is Alderman Richard Dowd. Welcome. Okay. All right, we'll open up to public comment. Does anybody here would like to address the board? Mr. Proman, yes?
Mr. Chairman, when the petition for facade easement comes before the committee, I'd like to speak to it if I could, please.
Yes, at that particular time, we'll allow you to come up and.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. At this time, we have scheduled, we're going to welcome Tim Cummings, the Director of Economic Development, to come forward to give us a presentation on the Bridge Street intersection project. Mr. Cummings. Thank you, sir. And, yes, your guest, please.
So for the record, Tim Cummings, Director of Economic Development. I'm here before you this evening with our McFarland Johnson, Brian of McFarland Johnson, who is going to help assist with the presentation, because the reason why we wanted to come back before you this evening was that, if you recall, a year or so ago now, maybe a little more than that, Brian and his team and myself and Julie Shizmith from the city, we came before you and talked about making some improvements over by the Hudson line with the what was always thought of or conceived to be a quote-unquote roundabout at the Bridge Street, East Hollis Street in gateway to Hudson. And so with that being said, we started doing preliminary engineering design, and we developed 3 proposals, basically an X, an H, and an O. Through a vetting process, it really looked as though an H was the best way to move forward. That was the recommendation of the steering committee and this body and the Board of Public Works, and it appeared as though it was moving in good stead. It was reviewed at the state level, and the Department of Transportation had some comments and made some notes and asked for some differing analysis to be done. Upon doing that, we realized that we were causing a bottleneck or some backup into Hudson. Obviously wanting to be neighborly and not do that, we thought it best to reconfigure the proposed design, which McFarland Johnson has done. We brought it back to the steering committee earlier this month. The presentation that you're about to see and the design that you're about to see is supported by a majority of the steering committee. I'd like to get this body's approval so we can resubmit it to the Department of Transportation, so we can have so we have confidence that this is the, if you will, the preferred alternative for us, and then we can proceed further along in the transportation improvement process, which will be final design and then ultimately construction. So, so with that being said, I'll turn it over to Brian, who can speak to the details.
All right, thanks, Tim. Yeah, just for the record, name is Brian Colburn, work for McFarland Johnson, and as Tim said, we're the engineering consulting firm working on the project for the city. Just a brief agenda. Again, I'll kind of summarize what Tim said, go over this revised alternative, outline the steps moving forward, and then I have a spot here for questions and answers at the end, but feel free to ask questions as we come along. So just to refresh your memories, again, we were back here a year ago, but the project limits are really the intersection of Bridge Street and East Hall Street, from the town line back to about C Street. And the figure on the screen there, it's highlighted in with a red dashed line around it. So That was our limits of study. Our project goals here were to address all modes of transportation, not just cars, moving cars, but also moving people, moving bicycles. You know, recognizing it's part of a neighborhood as well, not just a regional. It's not just a regional traffic issue here. Maintain current traffic capacity, making sure whatever we do here, we're not causing additional backups. And we were building on some previous studies that were done a few years ago. One of those studies had concluded a roundabout as the preferred alternative. So one of our initial steps, again, was to review that, and we found that that was not going to work at this location. Again, just a refresher that the program, the project's funded through a grant from New Hampshire DOT. They have a process for developing projects. We are in step 1, which is the engineering study phase. This is where we select the preferred alternative. Once this is approved, we go into preliminary design, really nail down the impacts of the project, and then from there we move to final design and then construction. So we are in the initial step here. Just a recap of the project timeline, as Tim mentioned, we were spent most of 2018 developing our 3 alternatives. We had several public meetings, about half a dozen meetings or so with a steering committee that culminated in August, where they recommended alternative 3. And I'll show the alternatives we looked at coming up. We were in front of this committee late October and the Board of Public Works, both of which endorsed the preferred alternative at the time. We submitted our report to New Hampshire DOT at the end of November. We got their comments back early of this year. It took a while. Some of those comments weren't as clear as I guess we had hoped, so we needed to schedule a meeting. That took a couple months to get on the books. So we had a good understanding of what their concerns were in early May. And as Tim mentioned, one concern was they wanted us to look at the traffic operations in a separate way from the way we had done it. So that took us in about the middle part of this year, and ultimately found that it wasn't working as well as we had thought, this alternative 3. So we looked at some alterations to the alternative, and then also looked at a new alternative. Presented that new alternative to the steering committee in the middle of the month. As Tim said, they have endorsed it, and now we're back here. So our steering committee members, from the city perspective, we have an alderman representative. We have a fair amount of city staff. We also have Peter Schaefer, who's a resident of the area. We have the property manager for SMC Management. That's Riverfront Landing, the development just to the north and adjacent to the intersection. And we also had a representative from the town of Hudson, who was a great addition to the steering committee because he actually lives in Riverfront Landing as well. So he's kind of wore 2 hats at the meeting, which was good.
He knows the area well.
He knows it very well. So again, this was the alternative 1, which we refer to as the X, more or less what the traffic configuration is there today. Obviously moves traffic very similar to the way you see it today, but doesn't do a lot for improving access to Riverfront Landing, which is to the north, to the top of the page, and doesn't do anything for a possible connection to the Crown Street area, which would be south or down on the bottom of the page. So this wasn't really looked favorably upon for all the other goals that the project was trying to achieve. Alternative 2 was what we considered an O. It was somewhat of a take on the roundabout concept, but we were having to put signals at each of the legs to control the flow of traffic and adjust to how the peak demand on each leg changes throughout the day. People at public meetings expressed concern about how confusing this might be, just having to go around and around. And some of the traffic simulations that we had for this actually showed it lock if too much traffic got in. So if one of the queues, say from Hudson, their signal wasn't operating great and the traffic backed up over the bridge, that queue gets into this O, and it can actually cause traffic to stop in all directions. Had a fair amount of green space to it, but the green space, a lot of it was located in the center of that O. Alternative 3 is the one we refer to as the H. Just 2 signals. Intersections got fairly wide, some of them 5 lanes in width. You can see here the opportunity for a future street to the Crown Street area to the south was going to be pretty easy to accommodate. That would go into just right into the signal on the bottom part of the page. And our initial analysis had shown that this pretty much was operating similar to what existed today. When we ran the new analysis, especially in the morning peaks, it did show the queue, the backup of traffic extending into Hudson, into their signal complex, which would cause that whole area to operate a lot worse than it does today. So our first step was we looked at, what changes could we make to this to get it to operate better. This option had a dedicated left turn lane into the driveway at Riverfront Landing. So anybody coming along Bridge Street wanting to make that left would go up to the new signal and would have their own dedicated green time to get in there. This allows us to get rid of the temporary signal at D Street and allows Riverfront Landing to no longer require their temporary easement across the property just to their west. Fortunately, what we found to get this to work is we needed to take that dedicated left turn lane into Riverfront Landing away. So people on Bridge Street who want to get to Riverfront Landing would have to make a left across from D Street and continue to use that temporary easement. Obviously, the owners of Riverfront Landing weren't real pleased with this, so they expressed some concerns. We went back to work and started brainstorming again about maybe something different that we could do, and we came up with alternative 4. Haven't really come up with a good name for this shape or design yet.
Ghostbusters.
Ghostbusters
Yeah.
has been thrown out there. And I'll go through in a bit how this operates and where traffic flows, but it's basically if you're coming from Hudson across the bridge and you want to go to East Hall Street, you're going to cut across the center of the circle. Another thing that we're investigating now is, you'll see it in the purple line, is a path from this intersection down to the path that exists on the levee, and improving the path that goes under the bridges right now. It's fairly large rock and not that easy to navigate under there. So we actually have a meeting scheduled with the Army Corps of Engineers next week. They're going to be up inspecting the levee anyway, so we're going to grab a couple minutes of their time and talk through some ideas and the process for potentially including that as part of the project.
So if I may, on this particular point, when we were meeting with the steering committee a few weeks back, the resident Peter Schaefer expressed a strong sentiment that, he really wants to see some sort of connectivity to the Merrimack riverfront, and he believes it's long overdue for the neighborhood. So we told them that we would, do the best that we could and make a good faith effort to try to bring that amenity into this project. I don't know if you can see my mouse here.
So these dashed lines here are where a potential future Crown Street connection would come into the intersection as well. So just to prove we didn't come up with this idea out of the blue, this is actually an intersection in Revere, Massachusetts, I believe.
Yeah.
So again, you can see it kind of has that circular motion for some of the movements that are signal control, but does take, in this case, 2 of the through movements and brings them straight through the center of the circle. So I know looking at this plan, it can be somewhat confusing about how you get through it. So we've created some slides that show some of the movements So again, the red line is how you would go from Hudson onto East Hollis Street. The blue line is East Hollis into Hudson. The red line is Hudson onto Bridge Street, very similar movement to today. And the blue line is from Bridge Street heading into Hudson. This first intersection, this is just a yield condition. So there'll just be yield signs here. So the only traffic light they'll have to stop at is this one light here. And that's why, it's one of the reasons why this option performs a lot better in terms of traffic is we were able to get most of the movements to only have to go through one signal as opposed to the H where, some of those major movements were having to go through two signals as part of the project. So really just to go back, this is the only major movement that is going to need to go through two traffic signals, and those two traffic signals would be coordinated such that movement is pretty free-flowing when it's green time. One of the concerns from the previous one was how to make that turn from Bridge Street into Riverfront Landing. So this is how that movement is. You kind of go around. We'll have to be cognizant of the signing to make sure this is clear for drivers. But the representative from Hudson, the planner, took one look at this and said he was not concerned with how clear this would be. And again, this allows us to get rid of the temporary signal at D Street, and there'll no longer need to be this temporary access way across that property.
You have a question?
Yes, Alderman Dow.
I just have a question. What is that for?
This movement,
Oh, right, see where right there.
that movement,
I
I
don't see
think
where
it's
the
on
line's
the
going.
I think it's on the next
For
one there.
Riverfront- For
Yeah.
Riverfront Landing.
So that movement is for people from Riverfront Landing to slip over here and either head into the city on East Hall Street or out to Hudson. So that'd be how you get out of Riverfront Landing. And it's also there for this movement, which I should point out, these movements right now are not possible. This movement is also not possible. So for people coming from Hudson wanting to get onto Crown Street, would use this lane here as well. And then you can imagine that if a future Crown Street connection is installed, that's how people from Bridge Street would get to that connection as well as people from Hudson.
Ken has a question.
Yes.
Alderman Gedge.
Yes, when you finish, could you just go back to 3? I just like to look at something when you're finished.
It's easy enough to go back now if you want to do it now.
Yeah, just go back.
Okay. So some observations we've made. So the traffic analysis, both ways that we've analyzed it, the old way and the new way, show that this is going to operate with similar stacking of traffic to what you see today. The one exception is if you're coming out of the city on East Hall Street heading into Hudson, that movement right now has no traffic signal, so that queue is dictated by really the backup of traffic trying to get into Hudson. So that queue extends, I think, back to Ald Street under this alternative. But all of the other legs operate the same way they do today. It is a proven layout. So, we've seen other examples in Massachusetts that are working. This actually does have shorter crosswalk lengths than alternative 3 that we had. Some of those we're going to have to cross 4 to 5 lanes of traffic at a time. I think we have one that crosses 2 lanes here as our maximum. Again, some of the cons are a little bit more delay for some of the vehicles. The ones that don't have any stop sign or red light now are going to see a little bit more delay. And that's a result of adding access to Riverfront Landing and a future Crown Street connection. I mean, we can't, there's really no way to add access and not have to stop those people. And when you stop them, they're going to see a little bit more delay. And the other con is while there's a fair amount of green space proposed under this option, you can see that a majority of it is isolated in the middle. So some of the ideas that were tossed around before about community gardens and some other aspects are probably not desirable in the center there. So we see this interior green space as more of an opportunity to create landscape and a gateway into Nashua, a welcoming, aesthetically pleasing gateway. We are showing our plan to put a pretty robust buffer along this green space for East Street to help that green space more feel like part of the neighborhood and less of part of the intersection. But as Tim mentioned, our neighborhood representative did stress he didn't see that the neighborhood was getting a lot out of this project now, so that's why they were hoping for this connection to the path along the levee. So just moving forward, we are presenting tonight here and tomorrow night at the Board of Public Works. Once we get consensus that we're moving in the right direction, we will resubmit our report to New Hampshire DOT early next month, and hoping to get the go-ahead to move into preliminary design potentially late 2019, but realistically looking at early 2020. So I know that was relatively quick. We can take any questions you may have.
Alderman Dow?
Just a couple quick questions. One, not quick. One is, have you taken into account that if we're wildly successful with the railroad, that there's a railroad crossing in that backup you talked about?
The railroad crossing in the back, so that's not
Right over there.
it's
Well, you said that the East Hollis might be backed up to All Street. If you go all the way to
Yes.
All Street, there's
So-
railroad tracks in.
yeah, so
in
it
it.
does not back up to the railroad tracks.
Okay, the other thing is, I've been told by numbers of people in Hudson that no matter what we do here, if they don't do something on the other side of the bridge, not gonna help that part of the traffic at all. So is any effort been made to see if Hudson can do anything with their traffic?
So I do know the town has put in a smarter traffic light system. That, from what I understand, has made things a little bit better. So to make things considerably better in Hudson, they need a major project to do that, or for an opportunity for traffic to have another way to cross the river.
Right, exactly.
There's a meeting going on upstairs that I'm sure this concern is
Just
being
came
voiced
down.
at the 10-year plan. So again, that, getting back to this kind of the parameters we set on ourselves getting into this project, about there are things we can solve as part of this project, and there are things we cannot. And unfortunately, that issue is beyond the scope of this project.
Alderman Jettie?
So after this is completed, will the crossing times over the bridge, one way or the other, be improved or not?
No, we're projecting them to be the same as they are now.
So what is the purpose of this? If it's just going to be the same as it is now, what is the benefit of doing this?
All right, so I actually brought some slides from our previous meeting. So this was our purpose statement.
There you go.
Here. These were the 5 things we were aiming to do as part of this project. So again, improve mobility. So the new layout makes it easier for pedestrians to get from, say, the north side of the intersection to the south side. Particularly, one concern that was raised in the public meeting was people trying to get to the Robert Chris School to the south. Improved access. That was mainly for riverfront landing, but The side benefit to that is right now, D Street sees a lot of traffic because that's a lot of people use that to get into Riverfront Landing. So the project will alleviate that need. Facilitate land use is really associated with the Crown Street area. There's not a lot of opportunity to improve the signals at Arlington or Alds to get access to that area, to the train station potentially. There's land that could be revitalized. And our model took those potentials into account. We looked at that growth in traffic. So the proposed project, kind of gets it set up where there's a place for that traffic to go. Again, not adversely affect current operations. And then providing an aesthetically pleasing gateway. Right now it's definitely car centric out there. It's fairly wide open. And we plan to add some street trees and one idea that was tossed out is providing space for some of the public art that's generated every year as part of the Arts Festival. Place to display that, either permanently or on a rotational basis, to say, hey, welcome to Nashua. It's great here. So those were the goals of the project.
Okay, so can I ask more questions?
Follow up?
So if you could go back to the slide that shows this.
The picture?
Yep. Yeah, okay, so how will people get to E Street?
So similar to today, East Street's one way to the south. So we're not precluding a left here. I mean, they could stop in this lane and wait to get across if they're coming from Hudson. If they're coming from East Hall Street, I'm assuming they're using either C or D Street to get across. So that would be maintained. And then if they're on Bridge Street, they're making the right similar to what they do today.
Okay, so coming from Hudson, they would be able to make a left turn onto E Street?
Yes.
Okay. If there's a lot of traffic, they'd have to depend on the
Again,
good graces
yeah,
of people that are coming the opposite way, right? To let them through.
from what we heard at the public meetings, I think that's how they get in today.
Okay.
Is that, there's a traffic light in the center here that during peak hours backs up Bridge Street. Oops, sorry. Backs up Bridge Street quite a bit. So if they're wanting to make that left, they've.
Okay. And so there are several new housing proposals.
Mm-hmm.
The old John Mansville lot there off of Bridge Street.
Mm-hmm.
And then on Temple Street, there's a couple hundred,
Mm-hmm.
and then the Henry Hanger building.
Mm-hmm.
Were you able to take that into consideration? This is all brand new stuff, but were you able to take that into consideration?
So we did our traffic projections about a year and a half ago. When we did them, we did work with the city and the Regional Planning Commission to capture what we knew about at the time. But in addition to some of those spot developments, we assumed traffic was going to grow about 1% a year through our analysis period. So we're analyzing traffic that's about 15% higher than what it is today, to account for that level of growth.
Okay. And could I ask another one?
You got the floor.
Thank you. Did you give any consideration? I know that that your parameters are from C Street, I think.
Yes.
Forward. Did you give any consideration to instead of moving the traffic in all these different directions in this area. The idea of making, for example, the idea of crossing the traffic further west, so like in the Amory, Temple Street area, so that there's not so much crossing traffic in this concentrated area, and which would allow a more development of this area for recreational purposes. So, I don't know, for example, if Bridge Street was one way going west, and then, you would cross over to East Hollis Street by going, Amory Street to Temple Street.
Right.
You're kind of making a larger crossing pattern. Were you able to give that any thought, or was that just beyond your scope?
So we didn't look at it, but I believe one of the previous studies had looked at it. So there was an overall East Hollis gateway study that was done, and then there was a subsequent traffic study that looked right at this intersection. I believe a one-way larger loop was looked at and was not looked upon favorably at that time. So we didn't spend any time looking at that as part of our project. I will say, based on observations I've seen in looking at this, the traffic wants to cross somewhere, and we barely had enough room here to accommodate it. And I'm not sure if there's another area further into the city where you'd want to, dedicate that much right of way or property to putting that size of an intersection in.
I'm picturing Temple Street from Amory over to East Hollis. It looks like a lot of vacant
No, but
land there.
that's privately owned. So.
It is right now, but it could become publicly owned.
Could be.
Parts of it.
Yeah, I agree. It's underutilized land, but some of the goals that we were trying to achieve with the design, one, in this current design here, we are doing as much as we can to stay in the existing right of way of the city. So to minimize any type of permanent takings, there may be some temporary easements necessary for construction and whatnot, but we are working very hard to try to maintain the current right of way. That's one charge. Another charge is the design that you're seeing is within the $3.6 million that's been set aside. And as of right now, 100% of this project is being funded by the state of New Hampshire. If it goes above that 3.6, I can't represent to you that they would pick up the differential cost, and that means then the city of Nashua would have to pay for it. So there are additional elements as well that drove some of the thought process as to how we arrived at this conclusion.
All set, Alderman Jettie?
Yes.
Okay. I do have a question. Well, can see, go ahead, Alderman Gedge.
Could you please go back to alternative 3, just for a moment, please? Okay, now I take it you've ruled that out. Is that correct?
Yes, this is the alternative where, especially in the morning, the queue that this light would cause for traffic coming out of Hudson would back up into the signals in Hudson, quite a bit farther than it does today.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, if we can, I do have a question. If we can go back, maybe Mr. Cummings knows, but looking at the E Street and that buffer that is there, one of my concerns in this neighborhood is lack of the green space and different things. I know this project comes with a fixed cost with the state and everything. I wonder if we can get some money appropriated on that E Street buffer. Is it big enough for a kiddie park?
I don't know. I think it's a quarter to a half an acre.
Could we?
I mean, we can certainly look at it, but
Yeah.
we have asked the
Right,
question.
and if I may, to help you out, what I
Yeah.
define as a kiddie park is the jet setting stroller set, you know what I mean? That mothers can come down and get access and allow the kids to be on some swings and stuff like that. But then again, I am concerned, looking at the width of those roads and, you know, concerned access for safety of people getting to it too as well.
I think we could, if we kept expectations really low, be able to provide some sort of recreational amenity on that. I've seen it done in other urban settings, so I think it could be done if that was the pleasure of the city to do that. We wouldn't be able to provide parking. You'd be using on-street parking on E Street. What's not represented right now in the image before you is some of that land is taken up by a Pennachuck water pump. We know that we can move that at some point in time, so there might be a little bit more space there than you know what we currently are thinking of. So, you know, could we put a small, jungle gym, swing set, something of an amenity right there in the buffer? It's definitely something that we could look at.
Right.
In addition to trying to create some sort of river access.
Right, and if I may, and I'll recognize Alderman Schmidt in a second, but looking at East Street now, I do say those, if my glasses are correct, those are cars already parked there, and I see maybe 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 vehicles already there that really don't seem to be interfering. I imagine they are tied up with the screen printing place, you know, so I don't see it being heavily used, you know, at that, but at least it is there because, in my opinion, the neighborhood is blighted for some amenities as far as a park.
It would be a nice amenity for the neighborhood.
And it could also enhance the welcoming design that we kind of are
Yep.
looking for. Alderman Schmidt.
Pedestrians, bicyclists, access to the river. There does seem to be a little space down there between the two bridge entrances that is lower than the roadway. Is this right?
Yes.
It slopes down quite a bit. Would that be an appropriate place for a kiddie playground?
You're
It would
talking
be-
about the area by the pump station down
Yeah.
here?
Yes.
So it does grade pretty quickly down, down into that spot. The representative from Public Works has expressed that they don't necessarily want to attract people to that area around their equipment, and you know, I think it's tough to see down in the hole just to keep tabs on people. So I think we had some concepts early on about you could do something in there, but right now we're not showing anything as part of this project.
Right, and if I may help out Alderman Schmidt, that is an interceptor that's direct communication right down to the sewage treatment plant, so you don't want to be anywhere near that. It's, you know, so I could see Public Works being guarded as far as both security and any potential problems in that area. I can see that and respect that. Further questions by the board? Seeing none. Any conclusion statements or anything? Very good.
I just would like to make sure that we can represent that this is, a preferred alternative to the state when the time
Right.
comes.
And if I may, I mean, you seem to have taken, like I say, I compare everything we do here on infrastructure as pieces of the puzzle, you know? And we have looked at the other piece of the puzzle that is out there, the commuter rail, that may come down with the potential for the station, and your dotted lines seem to be adequate enough for traffic flow to get into that and to get the commuters probably, twice a day that we may be initially looking at, the morning and the evening commute to get them safely out of there. Right, okay. Very good. All right. Well, I thank you, sir, for your presentation. Very informative. Thank you.
So, if I
Yes,
could,
Alderman Jettie.
So you asked whether you could represent whether this is the preferred alternative from the committee. I don't know if it's my preferred alternative, but, you know, I guess I accept what the recommendation is. Um,
I can assure you it's not my preferred alternative. I would have liked to have seen it dug underground but we have constraints that we all have to live with, so
Well,
this is what we got.
we'll see if we can build you the Callahan Tunnel.
There we go. That's what I'm talking. I kept saying it. I kept saying it during the meetings. Let's go underground. They all thought I was crazy.
Don't laugh. Boston went under 4-point channel. I mean, right.
And be a little mini Nashua big dig. I'm just kidding.
Did you ever notice that they say that's why the blue is above in the tunnel? It tells you when you're under the water, you know?
Oh,
Yeah.
very good.
Okay, enough of that.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. And again, thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
To the clerk, with communications, I'm going to step in here because
Yes, please.
I know the clerk in showing on our sheet here that there is none, but we did receive 3 communications after the agenda has been printed. So without objection, I want to accept communications from Tim Cummings, Director of Economic Development. Reason, 452 Amherst Street, release of the facade easement. Second communication to the committee from Linda McGee, Deputy Planning Manager, in referral to the Committee of Infrastructure, petition to release the facade easement. Third communication to the Board of Aldermen Infrastructure Committee from the Historic District Commission, and the subject is 452 Amherst Street, the Country Tavern, again with the agreement to release the facade easement. I think everybody in the committee should have at least a copy of these 3 documents. Okay. And so therefore, without objection, accept them and place them on file. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, seeing none, they are accepted. Unfinished business.
I show none.
Okay. New business resolutions.
None as well.
Okay. New business ordinances.
None again.
Okay, we have a bills table in the committee. I'll turn to the clerk.
I'll move to take from the table the petition to release the facade easement at 452 Amherst Street.
Thank you. All those in favor of removing it from the table signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. This was referred to the planning board and in August, and we did get their reply in the correspondence. Okay. I am going to look now, since it's from the table, I'm going to look to the clerk for another motion.
I'd like to recommend final passage.
Okay. The motion is for final passage. We are open for discussion on the motion. Mr. Perlman, if you want to come forward. Mr. Cummings, do you want to join us at this portion as well, too, please? Thank you. Thank you, gentlemen. You're welcome.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, good evening. My name is Andy Perlman. I'm an attorney in Nashua with Prunier and Perlman, representing Alamac Properties Limited Liability Company. And just to give the board a brief recap of what we're doing here and what we've done since we first met with you some months ago. Alamac Properties owns 452 Amherst Street, site of the Country Tavern. Alamac Properties has decided to try and sell the property, most likely to some type of retail or commercial development. They are constricted and restrained with respect to their sale because there's a facade easement granted to the city of Nashua back in 1982. And the purpose of the facade easement is to maintain the look of the existing building that's there today. The facade easement came about because when the property was converted from a house to a restaurant, the zoning board had a condition that to maintain the look of the building. Not so much for historic purposes, but just because at that time it was thought to maintain the look of the building that's there today. Fast forward to 2019, I think we would all agree that Amherst Street is a very different beast than it was in 1982. And the owners have decided it has come time to stop being restaurateurs and maintain this older building and sell the property. But because of the facade easement, no one's really interested in buying the building, just because of the nature of the type of business that's likely to go in there. So I filed a petition to release the facade easement. The petition, working with Attorney Leonard, was drafted and submitted to the clerk, which went to the Board of Aldermen, referred to you folks, the Planning Board. And the Planning Board also, out of courtesy, sent it off to the Historic District Commission, even though it was out of their district, that they wanted their input as well. Since that initial filing and referrals out, we've done a lot of homework. We've done a lot of work on this project, and we have developed an agreement with the mayor's office that both Tim and I can speak to. But before that, just some of the research that we have submitted to the city. There are really three pieces of the puzzle. One is, on two occasions over the past 20 or 30 years, the New Hampshire Division of Historic Resources has taken a look at this property, and on both occasions have said the site is not eligible for the Federal Register of Historic Buildings. And they did so because of the condition of the building, the changes that have been made to the building over the years, as though twice the state has said it really doesn't qualify for any historic preservation. Secondly, we hired Lisa Massoff. Lisa Massoff is a historic consultant who has been used by the city of Nashua on a number of times. And she did a full study of the property, looked at its history, and her conclusion was the property has little to no historic value. It was built in the early 1800s, but today, given the condition of the building, that's about the only historic nature of it. Is just old. It's not particularly special. It's not like any buildings we see in the North End, any homes that we see there. So her conclusion supported, or coincides with the state's conclusion that the property is not worth preservation. And with that, we sat down with Sarah Marchant, Tim Cummings, the mayor's office, Attorney Leonard, and we have crafted an agreement. And you see Tim's memo to the planning board that outlines some of the terms of the agreement. It was a negotiation back and forth between the parties. And so the city wanted to have certain salvage rights to the property. And so we've crafted an agreement that there'll be salvage rights to the city. We are going to try to preserve some of the mature trees. I can't guarantee, but we're going to make an effort with whatever buyer comes along to maybe even just on the setback areas on the outside of the property. There's some nice old trees on the property. There's a significant contribution to be made to the city with this project, and in exchange for that, should the Board of Aldermen approve our petition, the city will release the facade easement. We have positive recommendations from the Planning Board. I was with the Historic District Commission on Monday night. We have a positive recommendation from the Historic District Commission. You can see the requests coming from Tim Cummings for your support as well. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I can answer any questions the board may have.
Any questions by the board? Alderman Chetty.
So I don't want to, be in a position of second guessing what the other committees, like the Historic District Commission, have looked at this and have said that they don't object to it and that they favor it, as has the Planning Board. But I don't want to second guess what they've done, but I am curious in Director Cummings' memo to the planning board, he states that talks about Lisa Masoff
Also,
report explaining why the property has little to no historic value. Could either one of you kind of explain what she said, why it has no historic value?
Well, Alderman Jettie, if I may, at this time, I was going to allow Mr. Cummings to give his presentation. And Mr. Cummings, could you answer his question at that time with your presentation so we can elicit further dialogue on this matter?
Sure.
With your permission, if you're in agreement.
Absolutely, sure.
Thank you. Alderman, excuse me, Mr. Cummings, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, Tim Cummings, for the record, Director of Economic Development. So I was brought into this conversation a few weeks back, and I was brought into the conversation under the auspices of economic development. And what do I mean by that? Oftentimes, Nashua sometimes gets tagged with being a difficult community to work with, and sometimes there's messages sent out that we try our best, but oftentimes it can be a frustrating process, or we're overly bureaucratic, or we don't sometimes have the business interests in mind, and I've heard those sentiments, and I don't believe them to be true, and I think this actually is a good example of how we can all come together and try for both parties bring forward a resolution that will be appetizing or pleasing to all involved. So I heard those concerns. Attorney Perlman reached out to me and said, from an economic development perspective, do you think there's anything that can be done here to help help move this conversation along so it just doesn't get opposed, or a small business owner here in the city is stuck in a situation where it becomes untenable. So I reached out and spoke to the administration, community development, the chair of the infrastructure committee. Got a sense as to what the priorities were from everyone, and set up a couple meetings and facilitated a conversation that ultimately brought forward some really interesting elements. For instance, we learned that there was a historic facade easement put in place, and it was put in place in exchange for a certain type of use occurring on the building back in the 80s. But now we're in a different market, and we're in a different time, and Amherst Street is a different street than what it was then, and you need to keep that into perspective. We learned that an independent historic consultant came in, did an assessment, and there's elements that are historic, particularly in the barn area, but overall, the state has concluded that it is not of strong historic significance. And then we have priorities here in the city that we constantly are looking for differing type of funding for, whether it's preserving historic elements in other areas of the city, like in the historic district, which this property is not, or public art, and ways we can try to beautify the city through public art or downtown redevelopment. So with that being said, Mr. Chair, what you have before you is a recommendation from the Historic District, you have a recommendation from the Planning Board, you have a recommendation from myself that you have an agreement that outlines a $50,000 contribution to the city, exclusive salvage rights to be preserved for the city to be able to go in and harness those elements that are historic, and we will be able to preserve them and use them at a later date. Which are going to try to preserve the trees in and around the site. And in exchange for that, there'll be a release of the facade. To me, I think that this is a good agreement that everyone can be proud of. Thank you.
Alderman Jettie, are you satisfied?
Well, could I ask my question again?
Yes, you may.
So what Lisa Masoff's report, at least I was not given a copy of that, so I don't know what it says. I'm just wondering if maybe you, Attorney, with the chair's permission, Attorney Perlman could tell us what it said. What did she find?
I'll give a brief summary. In July 2019, Lisa may have provided this report, and I apologize for you not getting it. We did submit it to everybody I could think of, and I will get you a copy. She has a 10-page report, and she goes through her criteria, what she looks at when considering preservation or not preservation. So the first, she has an introduction. Then she speaks to the National Historic Register eligibility process, and she describes the 4 criterion that the federal government looks at, such as archaeological resources and architectural significance, and are there associated events or events associated with the property that could somehow give it some weight. She goes through them. The site didn't meet any of the criteria, which again coincides with the state taking a look at it. She debunked this ghost myth that is out there with respect to this property. She did. She came to the conclusion it was a good marketing ploy for a restaurant to open, but that was about the extent of it. There were.
Glad you brought that up. You hear that, folks? No ghost.
She described the architectural changes made both interior and exterior, which undermine the value of any historic significance. With converting the property to a restaurant, a lot of interior work was done. A lot of things were removed over time. And so those type of things she went through kind of painstakingly. And then she gave almost like a title history of the property. You're welcome to it.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Alderman Dowd.
Clarification, is your opinion the city's opinion?
What do you?
Originally, there was concern from Director Marchand.
Yes, so mine would be the city's committee. This takes in Director
Okay.
Marchand's concerns.
Yeah, I was never quite sure that it ever had any historical significance. I will admit there is probably some things in the barn people want to rescue. So I don't have a concern with releasing the facade. I will have concern over what goes in its place.
Of course.
Having been in that restaurant a number of times, there's no parking out front per se. The building sits up high, and then there's a steep drop off in the back, if you will, and the parking's behind it. So I'm having a hard time envisioning what could go in there
It's a tricky site.
and how it would be developed. So my only reservation would be what takes its place. But based on all the things that we've done on Amber Street over the last too many decades, it probably looks out of place now. I mean, I like it, but I don't think it's anything that is of historic significance or, you know, something that would be lost. So, again, I don't have any problem with their request. I will have concern over what goes in its place.
That's all I had. Thank
That's
you.
it? Okay. I do have a question, Mr. Cummings. I see here, there's going to be a $50,000 contribution to the city. Where does that contribution end up? More specifically, can the Board of Aldermen determine where it wants to go? Maybe where we're losing an edifice that had at one time designated Nashua, yet we're building another edifice down on Main Street, the Performing Arts Center. Toy with me a bit. Could the Board of Aldermen make a recommendation that that $50,000 go for the community good into the Performing Arts Center?
If that's the pleasure of the Board of Aldermen, whatever you'd like. There's no restrictions on how this money would need to be used.
And for the chairman of the budget, see his hand is up. Alderman Dowd.
just for clarification, unless the Board of Aldermen earmarks where that's going specific, like in a special revenue fund or for some specific purpose, when people give us money, it goes into the general fund.
Seems maybe food for thought, maybe, as we go on, maybe an ordinance may need to be constructed then, seeing if that's allowed. Mhm. Very good.
It could also be earmarked for infrastructure improvements on that portion of Amherst Street,
It could.
whether
Granted,
it's sidewalks, crosswalks, whatever.
it could. I just threw it out there. We all have our little, right?
Having more significance.
I think we could all find a way to.
Yeah,
spend
spend $50,000,
That's
yes,
right,
yes,
that's right.
yes,
We can definitely find ways
But I
to
used
spend it.
my example as an example, so yes, yes. Well taken. Any other further questions? All right, before I call for the vote, I would just like to say in the statement, when this idea was first came to us, and Mr. Perlman, to you, you may remember that first meeting at the hearing here, and I would have to say, you and your principals and with Mr. Cummings and several other people that have worked on this, I would like to thank our fellow boards, the Planning Committee, the Historical District Committee. The matter was referred to them and then come back and everything else, and it really shows how we in the city can work. The fact that we can get a 50,000 contribution, exclusive salvage rights to the city of some of the portions that are in that structure, efforts to maintain the trees on the site and release of the fire cat agreement shows that the system does work. So I thank you, sir, for
Thank you.
working with us on that, and I think it's a good deal for the city. So therefore, if I may, I will call for the vote. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you, Mr. Perlman.
Thank you again, thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you,
Have a
Mr.
good night.
Cummings.
Thank you.
Mr.
Record, I'm
Cummings,
not part of the committee, so I don't vote.
okay. Mr. Cummings, if you do have just 2 seconds in case there is a
Happy to.
question,
Yep.
you are here.
I'm happy to.
All right, good luck, gentlemen. Thank you.
Take care.
All right. There being,
care.
thank you. There being no objection, I'm going to keep R 19-150 on the table. R 19-150 is authorizing the city of Nashua into a licensing agreement for a parking area off Artillery Lane, Nashua abutting map 63, lot 45. What I know of right now, we are still in negotiations at this particular time and discussing, so remove it from the table would be premature at this particular time, and if it's the pleasure of the board, we shall keep it. That also being said, I'm going to keep on the table 019-036, designate an additional section of Bauer Street one-way easterly. There has, I am familiar, there've been ongoing meetings with Mr. Cummings and several other principals discussing that, and at this time, it would be too premature because not all the stakeholders have been informed and brought up to speed, so it would be premature to take it off the table at this particular time. So there, without objection, they shall remain on the table. Now, at this time, we're leading into general discussion, and we're looking forward to the city treasurer, Mr. Fredette, and he's going to discuss property taxes. And Mr. Cummings, just in case the board had a question, is why I asked you to stay, but
You stay.
they seem to be content. Good luck, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, David.
Yeah.
Yes,
Okay.
Mr. Fredette,
Thank
we're waiting on you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for allowing me to come tonight. I don't have any handouts tonight, but I will at the next meeting for sure. I just wanted to brief the committee on a little bit about the process of deeding property, because this is the committee that hears that and decides if we will deed or not deed. I came here 2 years ago, 2017 in the fall, but I believe everybody on the committee now was not on the committee 2 years ago. So, were you? But you're not on the committee now. Okay, no. So, I don't know how familiar you are with the whole process, but, as you know, after, a certain period of time that people don't pay their taxes, we can deed their property. We are not very aggressive in deeding. We never have been, but we deeded, 2 years ago, and we'll probably be deeding some this year. I meet with everybody that, before they ever come to this committee, and they're people I've dealt with for many years sometimes. Sometimes it's very difficult. Some people have, health issues, very serious sometimes. So what we try to do when we meet with them is at least get them on some kind of a payment plan, so they actually make routine payments. And if they keep that up, we usually just talk to them once in a while, but we don't usually get any pressure to take the property. But I have a list that will be being forwarded to you. I think either at your next meeting or maybe in November, I'm not sure yet, but it will have around 15, 20 properties on it. Some of them owe quite a bit of money because it's multiple years. And I've dealt with them for many years, and some of them just are refusing to pay. So I think decisions have to be made on some of these for sure. There are several reasons why you don't deed, and that there's different laws that allow you to do that. One of them is if the property is considered to be contaminated. That's one reason why you may not deed. And actually, we have some like that. The tannery is one of them, as you probably know. They, owe back taxes going back to, I think, 1984 maybe. And there's some other ones like that in the city. So I can review that with you at that time. And then there's others there's another law that allows you not to deed for kind of miscellaneous issues. And they can be if the property is a condominium or a mobile home. Because if we do deed, then you begin to pay the monthly condo fee or the park rent. We work with the mobile home parks in the city, the managers, and we try to get people to pay, so that's been fairly successful. Trying to think what else, let's see. You can't deed a property until after 2 years and 1 day from when it's liened. But that actually ends up being almost 2.5 to 3 years because we only lien in April of each year. So if somebody's late on their taxes in July, and then they're late in December, that following April is when we lien. And then you cannot actually deed until 2 years and a day after that date. When you place a lien, the interest rate or the penalty is used to be 18%. It was recently changed by the state legislature, and now it is 14%. So the penalty is steep, and it should be. So the city actually, when people do pay off or the property is sold, there's different reasons, we do collect that penalty. And we collect over $1 million a year in those penalties. So that's it is a revenue stream for the city. It's not meant to be, but it is. So that's why sometimes we are not aggressive on taking some of the property, but again, that would be the choice of this committee. The minutes of the committee goes to the full board, and when the full board approves the minutes, that's the final step. Then we work with these people for a while before we deed. I know 2 years ago, we had a list of properties, and maybe 5 or 6 of them actually paid up before we actually deeded. So that always happens. But we did deed about 4 or 5 properties 2 years ago, which one is on Canal Street, One is on West Taller Street, vacant lot on Main Street, and a few other smaller lots, I think. So I just wanted to update the board, like I said, the committee, because you haven't been through this before.
Alderman Dowd.
Yeah, just a couple of things. In discussions with Corporation Counsel, I think there are times that you can take it without going 2.5 years. And you and I have talked about a couple of properties that, I'm not gonna mention the properties, but you know which they are.
You mean the little lots? Yeah, they're on the list.
Good. Um,
But no, you cannot take them before that. I never heard of that before. It has to be over 2 years and 1 day.
Well, this particular area, which is no access, and I'm gonna put legislation in to discontinue all these
Yeah.
paper streets. It's property bound, and I think there are ways that can be taken sooner.
Well, there's only a few there that, I think I told you that. There was a few of them. I can't remember how many, but,
There's two. I
Two.
got 'em.
well, they're on the list.
Good.
So now, if
Jenny?
if they pay their taxes, then you can't take it.
Well, yeah, but I think you said that this one hadn't paid taxes in quite a while.
Yes, probably.
So, does that, when they don't pay their first taxes, is that when the 2.5 years starts?
Yes, it's whenever that first lien is placed, 2.5 years after that first lien.
And you,
But we place
and-
lien on every year, every
So
delinquent
when
year, it has a
you-
lien is placed on it.
come back with that list with these two properties on it, can you say when that started? And so we could take those if they've been more than 2.5 years.
They have been. I know that.
I
so.
know, that's what I said.
So yes, I can tell you that.
All right.
Alderman Jettie.
So I have several questions, if you don't mind.
Mm-hmm.
Could you review for us what the people who are having a hard time financially,
Mm-hmm.
what exemptions can they take advantage of as far as getting a break on taxes? Are there any?
Well, of course, that's what we try to first, educate them on, that there's the elderly exemption, there are veterans credits. There's one that is for elderly and the poor, very, very hard to qualify. I think there's only a few people in the whole city that get that, but that goes through all the assessing department and the Board of Assessors. They grant those. So we do go over all that with these people. Most people who owe back taxes have no mortgage on their property. If you have a mortgage on your property, your taxes are paid. It's people who have no mortgage. So a lot of them are inherited. They inherited the property, or they've just people who have lived there for many, many years. We've had a few over the years that didn't pay and didn't realize there was an elderly exemption, and when they applied, they qualified. So they may owe like 2 years, going back quite a few years, but every year after that, they've qualified. So, we don't anticipate taking that property. The people will live there as long as they can. But there's not a few of those, there's not a lot. So I'm not sure if I answered your question, but
Do you know off the top of your head what the elderly exemption is and what the qualifications are?
well, of course, that's assessing, but I believe you can't have more than 125 or 150,000 in assets, not including your home. But it does include a second home or your car or CDs, savings accounts, all that kind of stuff. We give, right now, the city issues around 850 elderly exemptions. 850 properties get the elderly exemption. And I think around 300 pay no taxes at all. So it's that the asset level, there's an income level, I think it's 50,000. And as you get a little older, the exemption grows. So it starts at 65, it increases at 75, and then at 80 it increases. So a lot,
5 years of age.
yeah,
75
65 years.
of age.
I don't remember the exact exemption amount. You can find it right on the city website. But a lot of the people who may not pay anything are probably people who are over 80 because the exemption is the largest. I think it's around 255,000. So if somebody has a small cape or a small ranch, they probably pay no taxes. So I know there's about 800 properties that qualify right now for that.
When we send out the tax bill, do we inform people of these exemptions so that,
All the exemptions and credits are listed on the back of the tax bill.
okay, good,
They only have to read it.
okay?
And, there used to be quite a few stories about it in the paper, but not lately, but they used to be. And I am amazed, though, sometimes how some people have never heard about it. Even the veterans credit, I find veterans who don't know anything about it sometimes, so, and it is $500, so it's a good amount of money. Actually, I think it was increased, so it's even more than that.
Years ago.
Could I follow?
You want more?
I have a couple more.
Well,
If I could.
okay.
So you mentioned, properties that you wouldn't want, like the tannery, because of the liability.
Right.
But do we ever use any alternative collection procedures, like if, like, let's say a family, the Sacklers or whatever, that family that owned
Oh.
the drugs, if they owned a piece of property and didn't pay their taxes and it was contaminated, so we didn't want it, do we ever try to collect from them? I mean, people might have other assets other than the property itself. Do we have the right to, and can we sue them and try to collect the taxes from their other assets?
I've never heard of that happening. No, I'm not familiar with that at all.
Okay. Okay, and one more.
Run the table, go ahead.
When you talk about, deeding the property after 2 years and a day, is that, what's the procedure? Do we have to have an auction? Can other people bid on it?
When you deed the property and the city ends up owning it, the aldermen have the right to do anything they really want with it. They can just keep it. I mean, they can sell it. They can do an RFP. They can do by auction. They have different choices. But if you decide to sell it, you need to notify the former owner the first 2 years after you take it, and that former owner has the right to repurchase the property for all the back taxes and some penalties. If they don't, and you sell, let's say it's just a regular home, and you sell it, and after you sell it, you have enough to collect all the back taxes, and there's actually leftover money, you have to return that amount to the former owner. Years ago, the communities would keep that, but the state also passed an RSA on that, so usually we don't have leftover money, but it could happen. So,
Thank you.
Okay. Alderman Dow.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I was involved in Manchester with the elderly exemption, and I can tell you that Nashua has the most lucrative tax exemption, elderly tax exemption in the entire state.
yes, if you just go in other communities, some very wealthy communities, and look what they have.
Yeah.
Nashua has very large exemptions and credits. They really do.
But Alderman Schmidt.
You've applied the liens, and you have how many properties to bring before us?
I think there'll be about 15 or 20. Some of them are vacant lots. Others are single-family homes. Some are apartment buildings. The thing is, we don't like the deed unless we really have a purpose for the property.
Right.
Because once we take it, we own it. And we've got to decide to do something with, we have to manage the property. In the past, I've done some of that, and more recently, Tim Cummins has done some of that also, so.
Did we
Very little
recently-
commercial property. Back in the last recession, there was a lot of commercial property that owed. A lot of people who were in the development business, you know, because nothing was selling. But that's not the case anymore. It's mostly just residential.
So this goes up and down depending on what's happening in the general
Yes.
financial world.
Yeah.
And now is a time that's high again, or
Now is the time what?
a greater number of them are not being paid that we're going to take?
Oh, no,
or-
a year after we bill, we're a 99% collected in
Oh.
taxes. No, we have a very high collections rate. Nashua has a very high collection rate. And that's always mentioned in our rating agency reports. If you look over our last 10 years, it ends up being like 0.2% that's owed. That's really what I deal with. I mean, the percent sounds small, the dollars aren't as small, but you know, we collect 225 million a year in taxes. So that's a good amount of money. So, but we have a high collection rate in Nashua, very high.
Further questions? Okay, seeing none, I would just like to say that if anybody has any questions, the city of Nashua does have exemptions for the elderly, the blind, that wasn't mentioned, and disabled, and the veterans. And all this can be found out if the citizen wants to go to gonashua.com, direct themselves to the assessing department, and there is a tablet there that brings up what is the actual requirements. I got it right here on my phone
Right.
while you people were talking. I was able to quickly bring it up. So it has all the things that people can determine. And like I agree with you, Mr. Fredette, we don't want to get into the property business. But there's one thing for sure is death and taxes. And the city of Nashua sounds like it has been very good with some of these people with long-term without collecting. So
That's true.
it may be time to, unfortunately, it's part of our job, but it may be time to take a look at that. So we'll anticipate that in the future.
The list will have some longer-term people. And it's exactly what I said. There's some apartment buildings,
Yeah.
homes. In the past, the committee sometimes would invite these people in. Sometimes they didn't. I mean, when I'm bringing the list, that list is pretty bad. I mean, we've tried for many years to collect. So,
Again, it's one of the unfortunate things that we do, you know.
it's one of my duties.
Again, any further questions? Seeing none. Mr. Fredette, thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
the update and the up and coming, you know.
So I will get back to you on when I have my.
Please.
you know,
Yep,
So
okay.
I may ask for a special meeting, but it depends if I can get it done for
Yeah,
October.
at that time, that's another thing, that I'm glad you segued into that. Some of this would be discussed in a closed fashion, I would imagine.
In the past, we have, when we actually talked about actual owners and some of the problems. They're kind of
Right.
very personal.
Right. And wouldn't, yeah, and I would say that I will check with the corporate counsel, but that may be one of those things to get into a closed session that we don't really want to get out there, and we're respecting the privacy of the citizens.
Right.
You know what I mean? In this type of situation, yes.
Yeah, we've done that. Actually, I think every time I've come, we've done that.
Used to bring pictures and property
Right.
descriptions.
Right.
So
Yeah.
it's sensitive information.
Okay. Again, thank you, Mr. Fredette.
Thank you.
Okay, at this time, we'll open up for public comment. Seeing none. Remarks by the alderman. We'll start over here. Alderman Jettie. None? Alderman Dow? No?
No, thank you.
I got nothing.
Got nothing. Okay. There's no reason for a non-public session. To the clerk,
Well, I would move to adjourn.
motion to adjourn is always in order. Thank you. We will adjourn at 8:27. Thank you.
Aye.
Aye. Oh, a motion to, all those in favor? It's always an order. Thank you. Aye,
Aye.
positive. 8:27. Thank you.